Round one of the 2022 Rochester Open. This tournament was held in my hometown. We had over 100 players. I played in the open section, which had about 25 players. I was the 3 seed, and I'm going to give you guys a recap of all 5 rounds, 1 round per day. So this is round number 1, and in the description you will see during these recaps, our Chess Goals courses will be on sale 35% off. Use the code OPEN, OPEN. It saves you 35% off all of our courses. All right, so game number 1, I had the black pieces against Cub Noble, rated 2004. And Cub started with pawn to e4, and I played the Caro-Kann. I was very excited to see a Caro round number 1. And we get the advanced variation, and I followed the Caro-Kann repertoire that we have for chess goals, 3c5. D takes c, pawn to e6, bishop to e3, defending this pawn. This is all part of the repertoire, knight d7. He pins the knight, so I can't capture either of these pawns yet. Everything's defended. And I throw in queen to a5 check. This forks the king and bishop, so the only move is knight c3. And now a6. What I'm doing here with a6 is I'm putting the question to this light square bishop. Either it has to retreat, which is not that great of an idea because then I have knight takes pawn on e5, or it has to capture on d7. That's the best move, which my opponent played. And then I take back. So now I do have the bishop pair. I have 2 bishops. White only has 1. But the downside of this position is I'm still down a pawn. White has this extra pawn. And I also have this pawn chain on the light squares, which blocks in my light squared bishop. So currently that's a bad bishop. And the computer does say that white's just slightly better here. a3. A tricky move. If I take on c5, there's pawn to b4, forking the bishop and the queen. So I drop back, and this is a dual threat. Now I'm ready to take either of the pawns, and there's not a great way for white to defend them. My opponent decided to try to defend both pawns with queen to d4. Well, this is a little bit of an inaccuracy because this queen is actually a big target for the knight on g8. So I saw this route, knight to e7. My knight's either heading to f5, forking these pieces, or to c6, forking the queen and pawn. So I was starting to like my position already. I felt during the game that I had kind of equalized here, and now I thought I could start to press ahead and try to play for an advantage. Knight to f3, knight to f5, unleashing this fork, queen and bishop. Queen drops back to keep the bishop defended. Takes, and now I play bishop takes c5. Here I wanted to keep the queens on the board because I feel with the bishop pair, I really want a dynamic position. I want the ability to attack. And with the queens on the board, it actually increases the attacking chances for me. And we'll see in a few moves that this decision does pay off. Queen to g5. So before my opponent played queen to g5, I was kind of looking at this move and I wasn't sure how to react, if I should be afraid of it, if I should try to castle queen side, maybe allow queen takes g7, put a rook on g8, attack on the king side. But then I kind of took a pause, took a breath, said, okay, just reevaluate this position. Don't be nervous because of queen g5. And I decided before queen g5 was on the board that I would castle. And the reason I was okay with castling, even though I don't have an f6 knight, and this king side does look a bit vulnerable, the only way to really attack it is to move the queen, play knight g5, and try for queen takes h7 mate. But the problem for white is that takes 3 moves, and I can very easily block it by playing h6. So I don't think there's anything for me to worry about here. I simply castle, and my position is great. I got the bishop pair, and there's really no compensation for white. Castle, and now I play this critical break, pawn to f6, offering a trade of the e5 pawn. It's forking queen and pawn. And once this e5 pawn is off the board, that opens up this dark square diagonal towards the white king, and it also allows these center pawns to start marching up the board because they're connected. E takes f, I take back with rook. Rook a to d1, and now I double the rooks. And here I was already thinking of threats. If, for example, this rook lands on h6, I have queen and rook attacking this h2 pawn. I might go for rook takes f3, remove the defender of h2, and then deliver the checkmate. I may also play rook to g6, go for some tactics on this pawn. So for example, rook g6, if that queen ran away, there could be rook takes f3, and the G pawn is pinned so it can't take my rook back. So I'm already looking at all these tactics. King H1. Now at this point, I was thinking, okay, maybe I should play it a little bit safe too, because in some lines, there's this crazy tactic. Knight takes D5, pawn takes back, queen takes D5. That checks my king and attacks both bishops. So sometimes with rook and queen lined up, white could actually win this bishop on D7. So sack a knight, take back, and then win the D7 bishop. Doesn't quite work yet, but I thought, let me just eliminate all those tactics, play King H8. White just took the time to play King H1. I don't think it really hurts me to play King H8, but the strongest move is to play Rook H6 right away, just immediately going for this Rook takes F3 threat. Rook to D3 played. Now we see the difference. With the Rook on D3, the Knight is defended. So the Rook on D3 is helping White control the third rank and bringing another defender into the game. Now Rook H6 is not quite as strong as on the last move. So here I played Rook to G6, taking the queen, but it's a bit of an inaccuracy again. Um, I should have actually played Bishop to G8, Bishop to E8 according to the computer, and then maybe try to route this bishop out outside of this pawn chain. So Rook G6, queen goes back, Rook H6. So now what I would like to do again is play Rook takes F3. My opponent has the defense, pawn to H3. And I have to give my opponent credit. He played a really good defensive game so far. You know, I missed Rook H6, but he's holding everything. And you'll see in the next few moves, he does a great job countering my threats. Bishop to C6, knight to D4. Now here I realized that I'm going to lose the bishop pair, but I thought this is a super solid position. I just play E5 after knight takes, pawn takes, which happened in the game. I'm now going to play pawn to E4, and these light square pawns work really well with the dark squared bishop. I have full control of the center. I still have my rooks and my queen well placed, creating a kingside attack. Pawn to B4, and I drop the bishop back. This is sneaky. I'm eyeing bishop to B8, which threatens a mate on H2. Queen goes over, rook to F6, knight goes back. So this pawn is triple attacked. Rook F6, put a third attacker, and knight back to D1 brings a third defender. So my opponent's just hunkering down, trying to guard everything, making sure that my one move threats aren't working. Pawn to E4. And at this point, I kind of lost the thread a little bit. What I should be playing for is, can I get this pawn up to D4? This is a critical move. If the pawn gets up to D4, that pawn covers E3 and C3. This knight sitting on D1 would love to head to one of those squares later on, especially this E3 square. So I need to play for D4 so that I can control E3. I played bishop to B8. This is an okay move, but it's easy to defend. Pawn to G3 was played by white. Queen to C8, poking at this pawn. Queen to G4. A great move by my opponent. And here I was kind of stuck. And this was an interesting time control. It was a 60-minute time control with 30-second increment per move. And one thing that you're going to see in all of 5 of my games from this tournament, every single game got down under 10 minutes per player. And it felt like we were just playing off the 30-second increment. And you do still have to notate with the 30-second increment. So I never really felt too nervous, but it does really rush your thinking. And it almost feels like you're playing a blitz game where you just have to move in about 20 seconds, maybe 40 seconds, depending on the move. But there's not a lot of time to do calculation. So we were already starting to get low on time at this point. And what I should do is figure out if I can get my queen to defend this e pawn so that I can push the d pawn. So a move like queen to e8, for example, this would be a great move, preparing to play d4. I play queen to b7, thinking maybe I'll go queen to b5, so my opponent goes right back, guarding b5. I bring the queen over to f7, and he goes pawn to a4. So you can already tell I don't have a clear-cut plan. I bring the queen back to d7, queen to g4. So a little bit of repetition here. I was trying to gain some time on the clock as well. Queen e8, queen e2. Now this was the big moment. Here I should play d4. Good takeaway from this game for me. look to bring those pawns up and really try to limit the scope of the opponent's pieces. Instead, I played bishop to a7, so I'm just kind of dancing around waiting for a tactic. This knight lands on e3, really good square for the knight. I play rook to f3, which I think is a good move. And the idea here is I'm looking for tactics. I'm thinking, maybe I take on e3. Maybe I play pawn to d4, threatening rook takes b3. Or maybe I just kind of sit on this and bring my queen in and poke around at these pawns. But planting that rook on f3 so safely felt very good in terms of my tactical prospects. King g2, again, d4, top move right here, kicking that knight. Instead, I play bishop to b8, not as strong of a move. It's not really threatening anything. My opponent just drops the rook back. So now if d4 is played, there's no rook takes b3. Again, d4 is a great move. Pawn to h5 is another good move. I play queen to g6. This is also decent. The idea here is I want to sack, pawn takes, queen takes, and try to mate my opponent here after opening up the king. Queen to e1, putting another defense on this pawn. So white is kind of holding everything at the moment. Now what I should do here, again, is h5 or d4. One of those two pawn moves. h5 is kind of thematic. Like just go for h5, h4. If this pawn pushes up, we could probably utilize the pin on the g pawn to create that h4 weakness. Turn that h4 pawn into a weakness. I played queen to g5, pawn to h4, queen back to h6. You can just tell I don't have a plan. I'm just kind of waiting for my opponent to make a mistake. And that's something I need to work on. Even though we were playing off the increment, both sides are spending 30 seconds per move. So I'm really getting like a minute per move to formulate a full plan. And some of the moves you can play quickly, build up a little extra time on the clock. I definitely should have spent that time to try to figure out how do I crack white's position here? Because my opponent is just waiting for me at the moment. Knight g4, queen to g6, attacking the knight. Knight goes back, hitting my rook. And this was a huge blunder on my part. I felt like this knight to h2 actually allowed me to win tactically. I blitz out rook takes f2, thinking I have queen takes g3 next. Rook takes f2, queen takes h2, easy checkmate. After rook takes, all of a sudden it hit me. My opponent can go king f1. I completely missed it. And this is just a massive blunder. And it's really no one to blame but myself because I spent so long not finding the crushing blows, not being able to finish that winning position, that I let the advantage slip. Even if I don't play rook takes f2 here, my advantage is much smaller than it used to be. White's defensive setup is really nice. And I give my opponent a lot of credit for just holding on to everything, kind of waiting for me to make a mistake, which I ended up doing. Okay, so takes, queen takes g3, king back. I got super nervous here. I thought, oh no, I might be losing. Um, I wasn't sure how to bail out of this position, and with the clock situation, I did not notice that queen to h3 was the best move. Because after king to e2, I was thinking, I'm just down a rook. How could I possibly go for this? That would give white a 1 point advantage. What I did is I played rook takes f2, massive blunder. All of a sudden, I'm losing. And a lot of times blunders come in pairs, right? So you lose the grip on the position, you make one blunder, and then all of a sudden just follows up with another blunder. That's what happened to me here. I wasn't able to reset and think, okay, just find the best move in this position, knowing that I already made a mistake. I kind of let my emotions get a hold of me. I wasn't able to reset and I blunder right away again. Queen takes, 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 takes. And now white's up the exchange, but it's even better than that because my opponent plays the best move, b5, and this is going to open up the rook. This rook is ready to try to come down here. It's currently guarded by the bishop, but there's definite back rank issues. And white's going to have this c pawn in the end that could become an eventual passed pawn. All right, so this is coming down the board quickly, attacking both. I have to trade twice. This is pretty much forced. Rook takes. Now at this point, I go into, can I play lockdown mode? Can I just get this bishop on the dark square, defend one pawn, harken back on f6, and hold the draw here? I'm definitely thinking I need to play for the draw. I push this pawn up. When I was calculating, I thought the obvious move here is rook to d5. It threatens mate and winning the d pawn, which creates a passed pawn for white. So keep that in mind. In the endgame, the passed pawns are extremely valuable, especially this endgame, a rook against bishop. White having a passed pawn is going to be like impossible for me to stop, and that should be a win for white. My opponent plays rook to b7. I was super happy to see this move. I was thinking, okay, I believe that's a mistake. Um, White is not going after the center pawns, and I can play king g8. So that's what I did. Rook to e7, and now I play e3 check. All of a sudden, neither of these pawns are attacked. My opponent moves the king, bishop to d6, and this bishop is now going to be able to defend the pawn one way or the other. And all of a sudden, I started to think, okay, I should have the draw here. I mean, I think I'm holding, but then I also have 2 versus 1 on the queen on the king side. And my king's over here ready to support these 2 pawns. Maybe I can create a passer of my own and start to play for the win, right? If white's just kind of shuffling back and forth, picture my king and 1 pawn marching up the board. I'll have 2 passed pawns. White's got to stop both. So rook d7 played. And I was happy to see this because now I could park the bishop on f6, defended by this pawn or defended by my king potentially. d5, I bring him back. Rook d7. Pawn to h5. So now I'm starting to think maybe I'll play for the win. And my idea was if rook to d5, I played g6 to defend it. And this happened in the game. Rook back to d7, bishop to g7. So I'm trying to figure out, can I inch this king up the board and then play g5? And then here I realize, well, maybe it's actually better to play king f8, get the bishop to e7 to box out this rook, and then march my king up the board this way. So I put the bishop back. King goes back to e2, king f8. And here my opponent got nervous. I think my opponent was thinking bishop e7 is coming. King comes up to f8. Ignore that arrow, sorry. And this king's going to march up, and maybe black's playing for the win. My opponent got nervous here. He plays pawn to c4. And I saw pawn to c4, and I was like, I don't know if that's so good for white. And I played d takes c. This is still draw territory with best play. But now all of a sudden, white only has the 1 pawn remaining. I can take it. And I know that king and bishop can draw very easily against king and rook. That shouldn't be any problem, I don't think. I haven't looked at that endgame in a while, but it's really difficult for king and rook to mate a king anyways. Like the tempo has to be just right. With an extra bishop, it should be easy to defend. Um, so yeah, I felt very confident I was going to draw, and I was thinking, well, maybe now I'm playing for the win. So here I grab this pawn. And my opponent plays the top move, king to f4. He's bringing this king up, trying to maybe take one of these pawns, create some checkmating threats on the back rank. I play bishop to e1. My idea here is the bishop guards c3, and this pawn is only 2 squares from queening. There could be some tactics here. I'm also thinking maybe I push the h pawn, right? So if this king is committed way down here, I sidestep the checkmate. If I have both of these pawns rushing up the board, that rook might not be able to stop them both, and maybe I can get the win. So king g5 played, pawn to c2. I had calculated out that this was a draw, and the best move, I believe, is rook to c7. Just trying to win this because look at this crazy line. Rook to c7, it looks like, oh, you could queen. Rook takes and fork. The problem is after king takes, bishop takes, king takes, there's only a bishop on the board for black, and this is still a draw. But we were both playing on the 30-second increment. That was a lot to calculate, and my opponent missed it. Played king to f6, trying to checkmate me. And I played bishop to c3 check. The problem is now the king has to move one way or the other. There's no more checkmate threat for white, and I queen on the next move. So my opponent resigned. Um, Really nice game, I think, by my opponent in terms of, the opening wasn't the greatest, but he played really good defense and caused me to make a mistake. To me, I only feel like perfectly happy with the game when it's a very smooth chart. If it's like anytime I get an advantage, it just keeps going that direction, and I really don't have the up and down spikes. For classical chess, I really don't like to see those spikes. That means my game was sloppy. My opponent held on so well that we saw the spikes. We saw that big spike down at least, and I was completely losing at that point. So good game by my opponent. This is round number one, Rochester Open. And remember, 35% off all of the courses. We have a new course player, courses.chessgoals.com. Use the coupon code OPEN, OPEN, and that'll get you your 35% off. You can also try the courses for free. So go check that out, and I'll be back with a round two recap tomorrow. Thanks for watching.